Chapter 14. O Body Swayed to Music. Jareth held 4 crystal balls close to his face. He stared into each of them in turn, catching the light. It seemed as though he were choosing among them. He took one of them and swirled it into the air with a flick of his wrist. It floated away from him, became a bubble. Then it drifted through the open window beside which he was standing, and away through the darkening sky. The other 3 followed in turn, coldly beautiful bubbles floating through the dusk, turning and gleaming, mesmeric globes glowing in the dying light. Sarah was still leaning limply against the tree, too dizzy to move, when the 4 bubbles approached her in the sky. She stared at them, entranced. She watched as the dazzling spheres floated toward her, slowly descending. They were dancing with the light, and she could hear music, an aching, haunting music, solemn like a pave. She was rapt, her lips parted in wonder. The bubbles were close enough now for her to see that within the first of them was the dancer from her music box, twirling pirouettes. In each of the other 3 bubbles was another dancer, moving with sinuous elegance. Sarah's body swayed hypnotically in time with the music. She was the music and the dance. She was inside a bubble, dancing, dressed in a ball gown. Enchanted and enchanting, she danced slowly across the sky in company with the other dancers. A congregation of many bubbles crossed the night sky, each with a dancer within it. They were approaching one great bubble as though attracted by some magnetic force. Inside the great bubble was a magnificent ballroom. Jareth was already dancing there. Sir Didymus and Ludo had come to the edge of the forest, and now they looked out across the bare, dry, cracked plain to the distant walls of the castle. Sir Didymus patted Ambrosius, who had found the way. "Good work, O loyal steed," he told the dog. He half turned his head to call behind him with a trace of smugness, "Yonder lies the castle, my lady." He heard no answer, and turned fully around to see where Sarah was. Ludo too turned around, a growl of suspicion in his throat. Together they stared back down the trail they had followed. Sarah had vanished. "My lady," Sir Didymus was shouting. "My lady." Above their heads a bubble floated past, moving in the direction of the castle. The ballroom had known opulence. Between glittering cornices were hung many long chandeliers where the wax, dripping for 100 years, had formed stalactites. The silk covering of the walls had faded, and in places worn threadbare. Bubbles decorated the room, and the whole of it was contained within the iridescent skin of one great bubble. A tall, gilt 13-hour clock stood in a corner. It was almost 12 o'clock. Sarah watched the dance, and the dancers watched her from behind their masks. The men sported silken shirts open to the waist and tight velvet breeches. Some of them wore wide-brimmed plumed hats. Others had capes or carried staffs. The women's gowns left their shoulders bare and dove low between their breasts. They had their hair coiffed high, and many wore long gloves. The dancers moved in a ring around the ballroom, with a kind of lethargic brilliance, as though the party had been going on all night. Men who were not dancing lounged indolently against the columns, or in a cushioned pit in the center of the ballroom in the company of women. Maids and footmen with skin the color of old parchment served them trays of fruit, and refilled their goblets from decanters. And always the dancers were watching through the eye-holes of their cruel half-masks, from which snouts projected and horns sprouted above. Moving together or elegantly reclined, they watched Sarah, or watched each other watching, and beneath the masks the mouths smiled at each other like knives. Sarah's gown was silvery, the color of mother of pearl, with puffed short sleeves. She had a pearl necklace on, and her hair was braided with strings of pearls. Her eyes were wide. She was the picture of innocence in that setting. a picture that excited the dancers who never took their masked eyes off of her, while they moved with weary grace to the cadence of a sinisterly beautiful tune. She walked slowly around the room. Two gorgeously gowned women snickered behind their fans at her. Sarah paused beside a tall mirror and looked at her image. The people passing behind her in the mirror were watching her, like ravishing birds of prey. The dancers swayed and swirled. Then Sarah saw something in the mirror that made her gasp. She had caught a glimpse of Jareth, entwined with a voluptuous woman, dancing past. She whirled around, but he had vanished. She stood there, peering through the throng for him so intently that she did not notice the young man leaning against the column beside her. He had his head held back and was staring brazenly at her. He relished her face and her white shoulders, her breasts, hips, and legs, and moved closer to her. He murmured into her ear, "You are remarkably beautiful, my dear girl." Sarah spun around to face him, her mouth open. At the mixture of surprise and pleasure on her face, the young man threw back his head and laughed. She smiled back at him nervously. Hidden behind another man's cape, Jareth had watched it all. But Sarah had not seen him watching. His eyes were following Sarah wherever she went in the corrupt ballroom. She was tense now, self-conscious, among people she could not understand, but who behaved as though they knew something that she didn't know. She moved hurriedly around the ballroom, looking for Jareth. She did not know why she wanted to find him, or what she would say to him. She just knew that it was vitally important that she should find him. When she saw him, he was whispering something to his beautiful partner, who responded by smiling knowingly from beneath her mask and licking her lips slowly with the tip of her tongue. Sarah blushed and turned away in embarrassment. She found herself looking into another of the tall mirrors around the room. Behind her, she saw Jareth standing alone. He was a resplendent figure, upright and blonde, in a midnight blue frock coat, diamante at the neck, shoulders, and cuffs. Ruffs of pale gray silk at his throat and wrists set off the pallor of his skin. On his legs, he was wearing black tights and shiny black boots. He was holding a horned mask on a stick, but he had lowered it now to look straight at Sarah in the mirror. Behind him, dancers were whirling. He held his hand out. She turned around, not expecting that he would really be there. He was, and he was still holding out his hand to her. She took it, feeling dizzy. Her dizziness ceased when she went spinning around the ballroom in Jareth's arms. She was the loveliest woman at the ball. She knew it from the way in which Jareth was smiling down at her. All his attention was on her. The touch of his hands on her body was thrilling. To dance with him seemed the easiest and most natural motion. When he told her that she was beautiful, she felt confused. I feel like I don't know what I feel." He was amused. "Don't you?" "I feel like I'm in a dream, but I don't remember ever dreaming anything like this." He pulled back to look at her and laughed, but fondly. "You'll have to find your way into the part," he said, and whirled her on around the room. She smiled up at him. She thought how handsome he was, but one didn't tell a man such things, did one? More than that, there was something in his face that was openly enjoying the moment without the mocking or secretiveness that she had seen on other faces here. "And when you've found your way in, stay in your dream, Sarah." Jareth's eyes were looking straight into hers. His smile was serious. "Believe me, if you want to truly be free, wholly yourself. You do want that, don't you?" Sarah nodded. "Then you will find what you want only as long as you stay in your dream. Once abandon it, you are at the mercy of other people's dreams. They will make of you what they want you to be. Forget them, Sarah. Trust to your dream." Sarah was spellbound. "Trust to me," Jareth said, moving his face close to hers. "Can you do that?" She nodded and looked up at him with anticipation. He was going to kiss her. She shut her eyes. That was the way to do it. Something made her open her eyes again. It was the silence. The music had stopped. She saw that they had been surrounded by all the other dancers. They were leering and nudging each other. She saw them biting their lips to hold back their laughter. Jareth seemed to be unperturbed, but she turned her face sharply away from his, horrified. He held her more tightly and insistently sought her lips with his. Suffused with disgust, she wrenched herself free of him. The clock struck 12. Sarah pushed her way through the jostling, jeering crowd. A man smiled foxily at her behind his mask and then grasped at her body. She smelled his evil breath on her face. She shoved him away angrily. A group of giggling women rushed between them, chased by merrily guffawing men. Sarah was knocked off balance and stumbled against a column. Crouching, frightened, she made her way out of the crowd until she saw the shimmering membrane of the great bubble just in front of her. Beside her was a small painted chair. She picked it up in both hands and hurled it at the bubble. The chair crashed through it. As the bubble burst, Sarah was sucked through it. She was flying through space. Below, on the ground, she saw the faces of Ludo and Sir Didymus looking up at her. Their mouths were moving as if they were calling out for her, but all she could hear was the thrum of rushing air. Behind her, the ballroom had collapsed and was crumbling to junk. Strange things and pieces of things and things of pieces were whizzing through space with her, some overtaking her, some receding. She started to recognize objects. The dancer from her music box pirouetted past, upside down, followed by several of her favorite books in random order, their pages flapping loose in the wind. Lancelot was not far away in the sky, and beyond him Sarah saw some gossip cuttings, and the spoon and egg cup she used when she was a baby. It was an aerial Sargasso sea formed of everything she had ever seen or imagined, but rearranged in improbable combinations. If this is the debris of the ballroom, she thought, then all my life must have been at that ball in disguise. The floating junk room of her mind stretched from horizon to horizon. It was all speeding up and beginning to spin around faster and faster in a maelstrom. Sarah with it. The rush of air became a screeching, untuned music. It stopped. Sarah was on the ground, in her clothes again. In her hand was the half-eaten peach. She held it up to examine it more closely. Its flesh was rotten. A maggot crept out from the pit. Sarah gasped and flung the peach away, and fainted. Chapter 15. The Time of Her Life. Sarah woke up in nowhere. She opened her eyes, and above her saw a somber sky, but the bare ground beside her was harshly lit, like pictures she had seen of the moon. Perhaps she was on the moon, for all she knew. She had been at a ball, that much she could remember. Where it was and how she had gotten there, and why. Nothing came to her, just the ball. She closed her eyes at the memory of Jareth, hot with shame at how she had succumbed to his charm. She felt soiled by what had ensued in the ballroom. Somehow it had all been her fault. Those men who pawed her, Jareth trying so rudely to force a kiss upon her. Had she been truly innocent, they would not have behaved like that toward her, would they? What was I doing? She asked aloud. She sat up and looked about her. What she saw was an utterly desolate landscape, a desert whose only features were heaps and scraps of junk. Sarah's face was blank with despair. There was nothing to do here. Nothing. No one in sight. It was a place where you would soon forget your own name. With an effort, she stood up. The first step she took landed on a small pile of rags. The rags moved suddenly beneath her foot. She jumped back. "Yeah," said an old woman's voice. "Get off my back." "Sorry," Sarah apologized instinctively without knowing whom or what she was addressing. A section of the rags rose up. Sarah saw that it was actually a pile of junk stacked up on the bent back of a little old goblin woman. At the same time it dawned on her that other mounds of garbage were, in reality, if anything here was reality, loads on the backs of other people, who were moving very slowly across the moonscape. She spotted the painted chair from the ballroom not far away, surmounting a pile that someone had collected. The junk woman's puckered face was staring crossly at her from beneath the load of bent and battered metal objects, discarded clothes, chipped crockery, and broken furniture that she bore.
"Why don't you look where you're going, young woman?"
I was looking, Sarah answered, slightly aggrieved.
"And where are you going?"
Oh, well, I can't remember. The junk woman sniffed.
"You can't look where you're going if you don't know where you're going."
Sarah thought that they could have argued the point, but she decided politeness would serve her better. She looked around and said, I was searching for something. The junk woman chuckled, mollified.
"Well, of course you was, dearie. We're all searching for something, ain't we? Well, you got to have sharp eyes if you're going to find anything. Now I found lots of things."
She glanced upward, indicating the burden of junk piled up on her back. Sarah looked harder at the woman's rubbish trove and found it curiously interested her. "Why," she exclaimed, "so you have." The junk woman grunted with satisfaction. "There's a cookie tin," Sarah observed, "and a colander, and some pieces of candle."
"Oh, yes," the junk woman was nodding. "It's hard to find classy stuff like this nowadays."
I suppose so. Sarah was looking past the old woman. Occasionally, a pile of junk would arise on the back of someone who wandered across to try the pickings in another mound. All of them were heading desultorily in the same direction, as though making for home at the end of the day.
"But don't you worry, dearie."
The junk woman had become like a grandmother to her now.
"I'll give you a few things to get you started like. How's that?"
"Oh," Sarah said uncertainly. "Thank you." The junk woman had started to trudge along in the same direction as the others. Sarah walked along beside her. As she went, the old woman rummaged with one hand among the pile of junk on her back, feeling for something. Sarah watched her anxiously, fearing that the whole load could come crashing down at her feet if she pulled out one item. Eventually, the junk woman said,
"Ha!"
and extracted what she wanted. She handed it to Sarah. It was Lancelot. Sarah swallowed and smiled with childish joy. "Lancelot!" she cried, hugging him. "Thank you," she told the junk woman. "Thank you." It was as though she were again the little girl being given the teddy bear by her father.
"That's what you was looking for, ain't it?"
the old woman asked kindly. Sarah nodded eagerly, clasping Lancelot. "Yes, I'd forgotten," she sighed, and gave the teddy bear a kiss.
"Now," the junk woman said, "why don't you go in there and see if there's anything else you like?"
She was pointing to a sort of tent they had come to, as colorless as the rest of nowhere. The woman bent down and pulled back a flap of the tent. Sarah took a step forward, saw what was inside the tent, and opened her eyes wide. It was her own room. Sarah was lying on her bed at home, clasping her teddy bear. It was nighttime. She was still dressed. She sat upright slowly and looked around the room. Everything was where it should be. She rubbed her forehead. "Oh, it was just a dream." She looked at the teddy bear. "I dreamed it all, Lancelot." She shook her head wonderingly. It was so real, and so... She gave Lancelot a squeeze. "I'm still a bit nervous." She tiptoed across to the door of the room, still holding Lancelot. "I wonder if Daddy's back," she whispered. Cautiously, in case they were asleep, she opened the door. The junk woman was standing outside, peering concernedly at her.
"Don't you like them things, dearie?"
Behind the old woman, the bleak, harshly lit moonscape stretched away. Sarah slammed the door shut in the woman's face. She ran across to her bed and buried her head in the sheets. After a while, she looked at Lancelot and said firmly, "It is a dream." She closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe calmly. "It's a dream," she said, and nodded. She held Lancelot tight. "It is a dream." She stood up, taking a deep breath, and walked confidently to the door. When she opened it, she saw the junk woman still waiting there. This time, she was in the room before Sarah could shut the door again.
"Best to stay in here, dearie,"
the junk woman had told her comfortingly.
"There's nothing you want out there."
The woman gave Sarah a wink and a confidential smile. Sarah had remained quite still beside the door. "Lancelot," she whispered. The junk woman was bustling around Sarah's room, picking things from the shelves and examining them. as though she were clearing out a house. But when she found something that caught her fancy, instead of adding it to her own pile, she placed it in Sarah's arms.
Look, here's your nice fluffy rabbit. You likes your rabbit, don't you? And Raggedy Ann.
The woman smiled fondly.
You remember Raggedy Ann.
Sarah was distractedly following the woman along the line of shelves. That the woman could know and name these familiar possessions of hers was bewildering. Below the bewilderment, something else was working at Sarah's feelings, something gray and listless, like despair. She recognized it, but could not be sure of its cause. What was it, this low feeling? It had to do, she suspected, with the way this old woman was fussing over her. The junk woman was heaping more and more things into Sarah's arms.
And here's your shoebox, lots of pencils and elastic bands. You want all of those. Oh, and look, here's your panda slippers. You know how you loved your panda slippers. Never wanted them to get thrown away.
Sarah sank down into the chair in front of her dressing table mirror. She spread all the objects in her arms upon the table and stared at herself.
Oh, and here's a treasure. You want that, don't you, dearie?
The woman handed Sarah her broken lipstick.
Go on, put it on.
Sarah took the lipstick from her and obediently started to apply it. Meanwhile, the junk woman began to load ever more objects upon Sarah's back. Peculiarly, they stuck there, one on top of the other. Perhaps it was some trick of the trade.
And here's your old horsey. You likes your horsey. Horsey, horsey, don't you stop. Just let your feet go clippity-clop. And all the badger books. Oh, and here's dear Flopsy. And the printing game. And your toy shop. It's still got the little candies in jars. And the Wizard of Oz. And there's the first knitting you ever done. Just look. You want that, don't you, dearie?
In the mirror, Sarah saw that the pile of stuff on her back was getting to be almost as tall a burden as the old junk woman herself bore. Moreover, her shoulders had started to look bowed. As if mesmerized, she stared into the mirror, into her own eyes, and in a distant voice she said, "There was something I was looking for."
"Don't talk rot,"
answered the old woman.
"It's all here, everything you've ever cared about."
Sarah looked around at the junk woman, who was still happily poking among the shelves. She turned back to the mirror and went on applying the broken lipstick.
"And here's your ducky book,"
the woman was chanting.
"You haven't forgotten how it goes up and down and quacks."
Sarah stopped listening. She had to, or she would have wept with humiliation. She looked around for something to take her mind off the junk woman's condescending litany. On the far side of the dressing table was the labyrinth, where she had left it. She put down the lipstick, opened the book, and began to read aloud. "Through dangers untold and hardships unnumbered," she recited, "I have fought my way here to the castle beyond the Goblin City, to take back the child you have stolen." She laid the book in her lap and looked around the room. The old junk woman was still prattling on, but suddenly Sarah had risen above it. "The child you have stolen." She remembered what it was she had been looking for. Toby. Everything altered. The room was the same as it had always been, night and morning, day after day, for as long as Sarah could remember, but she was seeing it with new eyes. It was all fabricated from pieces of scrap. Everything was rubbish, relics. All her things, the furniture, even the walls, the whole room was a garbage heap, a dead shrine to a spirit that had fled. The junk woman had noticed the new expression on Sarah's face, and was asking her in a concerned voice,
"What's the matter, dearie? Don't you like your toys?"
"It's all junk." The woman was taken aback. She stuck out her lower lip and made a grumbling noise to herself as she shuffled around the room looking for something, poking in drawers and along shelves. Eventually she found it and held it up decisively.
"What about this?"
she demanded.
"This isn't junk."
It was her trump card, the music box. She gave Sarah a knowing look and turned the key. Green sleeves tinkled through the room, sounding strangely like the haunting music of the ballroom. "Yes, it is." It was junk like everything else there, the litter of a time of her life that she was now passionately wanting to leave behind. She knew what the gray despair had been. This room was a prison, and she was her own jailer, and so she had the key to release herself, to go and do the thing that mattered. "I've got to save Toby," she cried. Faintly from somewhere beyond the room she could hear the voices of her friends calling her name. "Sarah! Sarah!" She recognized the voices. It was Ludo and Sir Didymus calling to her. She stood up, hurling from her shoulders all the stuff the old junk woman had been sticking on her. At the same time, the walls of the room started to vibrate. Things tumbled down from shelves, handles rattled, and the very walls began to fall apart, as though it were all jerry-built junk. Sarah looked around to see what was happening. Through the crumbling ceiling, 2 pairs of hands appeared, reaching down. She seized hold of them, and the hands at once hauled her up out of the room. She rose from a pile of junk and was set down on the firm ground. Ludo was smiling. Sir Didymus looked brisk and courteous.
"Fair maid," he said, "at last thou art with us again."
Behind them she could see a great pair of grotesque gates. Beyond the gates was Jareth's castle. Chapter 16. The Gates of Goblin City. Sarah looked at the grotesque gates and did not dare to believe what she saw. "Where are we?" she asked. All Ludo could do was beam with joy. "Sarah, back," he started to say. Sir Didymus interrupted him.
"We are at the gates of the Goblin City, fair damsel. Beyond thou canst descry the castle, and object of thy quest, didst thou not say?"
"That's right." Sir Didymus looked wistful.
"Thou art sure, art thou not, that thou dost not seek a castle that requireth 14 years of knight-errantry through travails and perils and—"
"Oh, Sir Didymus, Ludo, I have to go quickly into Jareth's castle, or I will lose Toby."
"Toby?"
Sir Didymus queried. "My little brother." "Toby, Ludo, brother." Ludo beamed.
"Ah, Sir Tobias, our brother-in-arms," Sir Didymus exclaimed. "Then forward."
He raised his staff, spurred Ambrosius, and charged toward the gates of Goblin City. Sarah and Ludo hurried after him. They did not see a shadowy figure lurking behind a junk pile. It was Hoggle, and he was watching every move they made. Outside the gates, a goblin guard was leaning on his spear, sound asleep. Sir Didymus took no notice of him, but rushed straight at the great gates and began to hammer on them with his staff.
"Open up," he bellowed. "Open up the gates, in the name of all that is—"
Sarah, catching up with him, put her finger anxiously to her lips and whispered, "Shh! Quiet, Sir Didymus." She pointed to the sleeping guard. Sir Didymus glanced contemptuously and shouted,
"Pshaw! I give not a fig for such goblins."
He repeated his clattering on the gates.
"Open up, I say."
"Please," Sarah entreated him in an urgent whisper. She saw the guard grunt and stir in his deep sleep. Sir Didymus was indomitable.
"Then let them all wake up. I shall fight them to the death."
And again he rained blows upon the resounding gates. The guard's eyelids were flickering. Sarah grabbed the tiny chevalier by the sleeve. "Please, please, Sir Didymus, for my sake, could you please try to make no noise?" From his saddle, Sir Didymus bowed so low that his mustache swept the ground.
"But of course," he assured her, "for thee, fairest of maidens, for thee, anything."
He put his mouth to her ear and whispered,
"But I am not a coward."
"Oh no," she whispered back. Ludo shook his head too, with great conviction. Sir Didymus had one point concerning his knightly prowess that he wished to settle.
"And my sense of smell is keen?"
"Oh yes," Sarah told him. Sir Didymus drew himself up proudly, and his voice rose again.
"Then I will fight anybody or anyone at any time, anywhere."
He thought and shouted,
"With any weapons."
Sarah was pressing her finger to her lips again. We know," she whispered. "Now please, Sir Didymus, shusheth thee up."
"Right,"
he said with alacrity. Meanwhile, Ludo had gone up to the gates and given one of them a little push. It swung open. The 3 of them sneaked inside. As soon as they had done so, they heard the gates slam shut behind them. Ahead of them was another pair of gates. This pair was already open.
"Ah,"
Sir Didymus exclaimed with a proud toss of his head,
"they dare not shut their gates against the might of Sir Didymus."
and holding his staff aloft, the flower of chivalry led his intrepid band onward. The inner part of the gates, however, swung shut before Sir Didymus reached them, and the appearance they now presented was 1,000 times more daunting than mere gates. Each door was half a giant suit of armor. When the two halves of the gate met with a thunderous clang, they formed one titanic mailed warrior whom the goblins called Humongous. His cavernous mouth uttered an unearthly metallic bellow. His eyes glowed. In one hand he wielded an enormous double-headed axe. Sarah whimpered. She felt the ground tremble as Humongous, axe raised, detached himself from the doors and stamped toward them. Beside her she heard Ludo roar, but it was a mere piping sound in comparison to the terrible noise made by this Goliath goblin. Ambrosius took one look and sensibly bolted. Sir Didymus, dumped on the ground, furiously ordered his steed to return. Ambrosius was having none of it. He lurked behind a buttress.
"Yah!"
Sir Didymus clicked his fingers in irritation.
"Were yon warrior and I to joust with lances, I would make short work of him."
Humongous was not yon now. He had come close enough to aim a massive axe blow at the trio. It missed them, but gashed a great wound in the stone wall. A fountain of sparks spurted from the steel axe head. The three dodged past Humongous's feet, but he jerked rapidly around and smashed his axe down again with both hands. Screaming, they leaped apart, and the axe hammered the ground between them, burying itself among shattering paving stones. The giant withdrew it effortlessly, and now crouching, he delivered a scything swing at them. They threw themselves flat, and heard the axe whiz over them in a noise like an ignited rocket. They saw the axe raised high again, and scuttled for cover to the wall of the courtyard. The descending axe carved a slice off a buttress. Blow followed blow. Each one would have left no more of them than there is of a mosquito squashed on a wall. All that had saved them so far was the inflexible, jerky motion of Humongous's attacks, which gave them a split second's forewarnings of where the next annihilating crash was aimed. It was only a matter of time before they got it wrong, and Humongous seemed to have all the time he needed, trampling after them around the closed courtyard, and evidently not wearied by the atrocious energy of his onslaught. In a brief moment between one blow and the next, Sir Didymus spotted a movement along the parapet of one wall. "Look!" he panted and pointed. It was nearly fatal. "Watch out!" Sarah screamed, and the three of them dived simultaneously sideways as the axe whistled and crashed down again, raising a spray of fragmented paving stones. While Humongous was lining up his next swipe, Sarah saw what the movement on the parapet was. Hoggle was running nimbly along the battlements toward the arch over the inner gates. "Hoggle!" Sarah yelled in encouragement, before sprinting between Humongous's feet and out of the way. It was obscure what assistance Hoggle could bring them, but he was scrambling so urgently up the arch that he clearly had some purpose in mind. Humongous shifted his feet like armored tanks to get his next blow. In doing so, he positioned himself with his back to the inner gates. Sarah saw Hoggle, now on top of the arch, crouching, prepared to jump down on the horned helmet of the giant. She covered her face with her hands, terrified, and peeped through her fingers. What hopeless heroism it was in Hoggle, like a flying attack of a locomotive. With a triumphant shriek, Hoggle landed on Humongous's shoulders. "Hoggle," Sarah whispered as she took off to avoid another thunderous stroke. Hoggle balanced on one leg and kicked the giant's helmet. The top half of it flew open on a hinge. Inside Humongous's head, a tiny goblin in a white lab coat with eyes staring madly through thick lenses was feverishly working a bank of levers. Hoggle reached down, grabbed the goblin under the armpits, and hurled him away. He landed haplessly on the flagstones of the courtyard and groped for his smashed spectacles. Already Hoggle had jumped down inside the giant's head and was operating the levers as though he had always been the engineer. Perhaps he did know what he was doing, or perhaps he tugged the levers at random. The result was that Humongous, elbows by his sides and arms raised robotically level, went into a convulsion. His feet did a shuffling sort of dance, his torso swayed from side to side, and the axe jerked rapidly up and down, and the neck swiveled faster and faster. Hoggle pulled more levers, and then had to make a wild jump for it, as Humongous went careening off blindly, with his axe oscillating and steam spurting from his joints. Hoggle landed in a heap at Sarah's feet. She helped him up, but had no time to speak to him yet. Humongous was now rampaging around the courtyard like a mad bull, bouncing off the walls. His axe was lashing up and down in long vertical axis, pulverizing the paving stones when it landed, and crunching into his own back on the reverse stroke. The giant's random movements eventually brought him back to the inner gates where he had started. On its next backward swing, the axe penetrated deep into the cleft between the two stones in the arch. It stuck there. In consequence, Humongous's next attempt at a mighty downstroke was converted into a terrifying leverage upward of his whole body. He was too heavy for his feet to leave the ground. What might have happened was that the axe could have snapped, or the wall collapsed. What did happen was that Humongous bent at the knees and sagged at the waist, looking like a failed giant hammer thrower, and little blue sparks shot up and down his armor as his circuits overloaded. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked Hoggle, bending down to fuss over any bruises he might have. Hoggle retreated a few paces and stood with his face inclined.
"I'm not asking to be forgiven,"
he said obstinately.
"I ain't ashamed of nothing I did. I don't care what you thinks of me."
He was toeing a little stone around with his boot, his eyes fixed on it.
"I told you I was a coward. Now you sees I was only telling the truth, and I ain't interested in being friends."
"I forgive you, Hoggle," Sarah said simply. Hoggle cocked his gnomish head and looked at her from under one bushy eyebrow.
"You do?"
he asked in a small voice. Sir Didymus strode across and slapped Hoggle's shoulder.
"And I commend thee,"
he said, with his other hand resting on his staff.
"Seldom have I seen such courage. Sir Galad himself will be impressed when the word reaches his ears. We owe our lives to thee. Thou art the fragrant bloom of knightly valor, Sir Hoggle." "I am."
Ludo paid his tribute.
"Hoggle, Ludo, friends."
"We are,"
Hoggle agreed uncertainly. Sarah had unfastened the string of baubles she had taken from Hoggle in the hedge maze so long ago it seemed, and handed them back to him. "Here are your things, Hoggle, and thank you for your help." Hoggle took the jewels and gazed down at them. Then he looked up with a puckered grin.
"Well,"
he said, and started to stride toward the inner gates.
"what are we waiting for?"
Sir Didymus called.
"Ambrosius."
His steed poked his nose cautiously around the buttress behind which he had been hiding.
"Ambrosius."
Sir Didymus raised his voice impatiently. Ambrosius did not so much trot as sidle up to his master. When the knight was mounted up, the party made its way carefully around the massive shape of Humongous. The blue sparks were still fizzing. Sir Didymus enthusiastically overtook Hoggle and beat upon the inner gates with his staff. Hoggle pushed. Neither of them could get the gates open, but it was an easy job for Ludo. Without Humongous, they were no more than a pair of heavy doors leading to Goblin City. Jareth was lounging on his throne, propped up on one elbow. Beside him was Toby. Goblins stood around watching them play together, and wishing that they had Toby to play with. It looked like fun. Jareth would tickle Toby, and whenever he was within range, the baby would punch Jareth in the face. The game had been going on for some time. Jareth chuckled. "Spirited little fellow." "In more senses than one," he thought. "But why bother to say it when all you've got in the audience are goblins?" He nodded. "I think I'll call him Jareth. He's got my eyes." Toby smacked him in one of them. "And my disposition," Jareth added. The goblin came running into the chamber, tripping on a chicken carcass, fell flat on his face, and from there delivered his message.
"Your Highness, the girl."
Jareth glanced up. "What?" The goblin was picking himself up.
"The girl who ate the peach and forgot everything?"
Yes, Jareth said testily, as though he had more than one girl on his mind lately. "What of her?" The goblin's eyes were boggling, and he had one arm flung out behind him, pointing.
"She's here."
Jareth stopped tickling Toby and scrutinized the moronic messenger.
"She's here, Your Highness, with the monster and Sir Didymus and the gnome who's in your employ."
"Here?"
"And they've gotten through the gates."
"What?" Jareth barked.
"The girl who ate the peach and—"
"Yes." Jareth's face was working. "She got past Humongous?"
"Yes, Your Highness. He's blown his fuses."
"Blown his... Where are they?"
"They're on their way to the castle."
Jareth stood up, holding Toby, who wriggled. "Stop her," the Goblin King commanded. "Call out the guard." The goblins milled around the chamber, screeching, "Cut the guard!" at one another. "Don't mill," Jareth told them. "Do something. She must be stopped." As one goblin, they all dashed for the door. "Wait," Jareth shouted, carrying Toby. He strode over to them and handed the baby to one of them. "Here," he said. "Take Jarethkin. She must not get the baby." The goblin with Toby ran off one way, while the rest rushed off to raise the alarm. Jareth was left alone. "She must not get the baby," he repeated to himself. "She must be stopped."